Today, we're going to explore 3 chilling true crime cases involving serial offenders. Let's begin with the first case. A plumber reached into a blocked drain in North London and pulled out something that stopped him completely. He called the police. The police knocked on one door, and a quiet, punctual civil servant in a trench coat answered it, thought for a moment, and said the rest was in the other room. 4 years, 15 young men, one address nobody had ever questioned. Dennis Andrew Nilsen helped unemployed people find work every single day. Nobody around him had any idea what was happening when the working day was done. But nobody becomes this without a beginning. To understand what Dennis Nilsen became, you have to start with where he came from. He was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, a remote fishing community on the northeast coast of Scotland, where the North Sea shaped everything about daily life. His father was a Norwegian soldier who left the family when Dennis was still very young, so Dennis grew up without a father, in a household built entirely around his mother, Betty, and the wider family around her. He was the middle child of 3, and from very early on, those who knew him described him as a child who did not form friendships the way most children do, and who seemed to observe the world from just outside it rather than from within it. The one relationship that genuinely reached Dennis in those early years was the one he had with his maternal grandfather, a fisherman who spent weeks at a time away on the North Sea, and who, when he was home, gave Dennis the kind of consistent and patient attention that nobody else in his life was offering. Dennis was deeply attached to his grandfather in a way that went well beyond ordinary childhood affection, and that attachment became one of the most consequential events of his entire life when it ended without any warning or preparation. One day, Dennis came home from school, and his mother asked if he would like to see his grandfather, and Dennis said yes, and followed her into the kitchen and found a long wooden box on the table, and inside that box was his grandfather, laid out completely still and white. And nobody had told Dennis that his grandfather had died at sea, and nobody had prepared him for what he was about to walk into. He was approximately 5 or 6 years old, and he encountered death for the first time as a sudden and total shock. Brian Masters, the author who later spent years corresponding with Nilsen, believed this was the moment love and death became permanently fused in Dennis's mind, in a connection that would eventually express itself in ways nobody could have imagined. After his grandfather's death, Dennis became even more withdrawn. His mother said she could never reach him the way she could with her other children, that he resisted closeness and seemed to live behind an invisible barrier. He had no real friendships at school, and when he was near the sea, he would sometimes go out into the water and act out near drowning scenarios, as if trying to follow his grandfather to wherever his grandfather had gone. At 15, Dennis made up his mind to leave Fraserburgh behind, and in June 1961, he enlisted in the British Army and was posted to the catering corps at Aldershot, where he trained as a chef. The army gave him structure and a defined place within a larger system, which suited certain parts of his personality, and he served for 11 years, rising to the rank of corporal. But he was never fully accepted by the people around him, and those who served alongside him described him in remarkably consistent terms across every account. Fellow soldiers remembered him as contrary rather than aggressive, always needing to take the opposite position from whatever had been said, and always needing to see things differently from everyone else. While his colleagues listened to popular music and read common magazines, Nilsen listened to classical recordings and read broadsheets, and seemed to take quiet satisfaction in the distance this created between himself and the people around him. The general feeling among those who spent time with him was simply that something about him did not quite add up. though nobody could say precisely what it was. What Nilsen carried through his entire army career and shared with absolutely no one was the fact that he was gay. And in the early 1960s, British Army, this was not simply a matter of personal privacy, but of genuine institutional danger that would have ended everything if it had become known. So he kept it entirely hidden and lived a double life from the very beginning of his adult existence. One version of himself for the world outside, and everything he actually was kept completely separate beneath it. And this structure of maintaining a public self, disconnected from a private one, became the defining architecture of his entire life. During this time, he also learned precise and technical meat preparation skills in the catering corps kitchens that his colleagues noted he applied with a meticulous attention that set him apart from everyone else around him. In 1972, Nilsen left the army and moved to London, and for the first time in his adult life, he found himself in a city where the part of himself he had been concealing for 11 years did not need to be hidden in the same way. London, in the early 1970s, had a gay scene that was accessible and visible in ways nothing in his previous experience had been, and he began spending time in the bars and clubs of Soho and Camden for the first time. He joined the Metropolitan Police shortly after arriving, which fits a pattern seen in individuals with his psychology, the seeking out of roles where authority and control over others are built into the structure. Nilsen lasted only 11 months before leaving, with those who examined his file suggesting his departure was likely encouraged rather than voluntary. He then joined the civil service as a junior officer at a job centre and settled into what would become his fixed outward identity for all the years that followed. What Nilsen wanted in his personal life was something the social world around him was not primarily designed to provide, which was a permanent relationship with someone who would stay. He was deeply aware of his own isolation and had spent years building internal ideas about what genuine companionship would feel like. But every person who spent real time with him described him as genuinely difficult to be around. Someone who talked only about himself and showed no real interest in the perspective or experience of anyone else, who was controlling and opinionated, and who relied heavily on alcohol. In 1976, Nilsen met a young man named David Galichan and found a flat for both of them at a property on Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood. The home footage he filmed during this period, which later became part of documentary coverage of the case, shows a man who is loud and domineering and constantly directing, always needing to be the one who determines how things are done and how they are perceived. Galichan walked out after approximately 18 months, and Nilsen later acknowledged the departure had hurt him significantly, though nothing in his outward behavior reflected it. After Galichan left, Nilsen continued bringing people back to the flat, hoping someone would stay, and he went to work each morning and came home each evening. And from the outside, his life looked like the unremarkable existence of a quiet bachelor. But inside, something else was developing. He would lie on the floor in front of a mirror with blue colouring on his lips and stay completely still for hours at a time. And those who had witnessed this and were later asked to describe it said they believed he was acting out lifeless stillness. This was not a one-time event. It was a deliberate and repeated practice that continued in the years before everything else began. On New Year's Day, 1979, Dennis Nilsen woke up next to a teenager he had met in a pub the night before, and he later said that as he lay there looking at the sleeping young man, the thought of that person leaving and of being alone again became unbearable in a way he had never experienced before, and that out of that feeling came an impulse he acted on without fully understanding what it would mean or what it would start. The young man was 14 years old, and his name was Stephen Holmes, a detail not confirmed until 2005, because in 1979, he was simply another name added to a list of missing persons that nobody was actively working. After what occurred that morning, Nilsen later described a state of detached and methodical calm in which he went about everything that followed as if it were a practical problem to be managed, and he hid Stephen beneath the floorboards of the flat where he remained for months while Nilsen went to work every day and conducted his life directly above. When it became necessary to remove what he had hidden beneath the floorboards, he did so at night in the garden using a fire to conceal evidence, and the local children who could see the flames apparently thought it looked entertaining and came to watch with no idea whatsoever about what they were seeing. Those who have studied this case most carefully have identified one thing as the engine of everything that followed, which is that Nilsen found in that first incident something he had been unable to find anywhere else in his life, a complete and total sense of control and significance that nothing else had ever produced for him, and having found it, he was not going to walk away from it. Between January 1979 and the autumn of 1981, Nilsen caused the disappearance of at least 12 young men at the Melrose Avenue address. The people he sought out were overwhelmingly young men who had come to London from other places, who had no fixed address, who were not firmly connected to any social network, and who would not be quickly reported missing by anyone. London at that time had approximately 8,000 people listed as missing at any given point, and the systems for investigating those disappearances were, by the honest admission of the officers who worked within them, completely inadequate for the scale of the problem they were dealing with. Nilsen had an ability that multiple people described as almost uncanny, which was to identify in any room exactly the individuals who were most isolated and most likely to accept an invitation to come back with him. And he pursued those individuals with a patient and consistent focus that he brought to almost nothing else in his life. After each incident, Nilsen followed a consistent and methodical pattern. He would keep the person with him for several days, treating them as company, sitting them in chairs, talking to them, going about his daily routines in their presence as if the situation were entirely ordinary. Brian Masters, who spent more time studying Nilsen's own account of his behavior than anyone else, concluded that this was the expression of what Nilsen had actually been looking for all along: companionship that could not leave, presence entirely within his control, connection that required nothing from him in return. When the arrangement became impossible to maintain, he would conceal the evidence in the garden at night, using a bonfire that neighbors occasionally noticed without questioning. At least 5 young men survived encounters with Nilsen during this period and went to the police to report what had happened to them. In every case, the matter was not seriously pursued, and the officers involved have since acknowledged that the decisions made around those complaints were shaped by significant institutional bias toward the community from which Nilsen's targets came. Nilsen was questioned following these complaints and walked away each time without any formal action being taken, and he was able to continue for years after those reports were filed and set aside. In October 1981, Nilsen moved to the top floor flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, and the practical difference between this address and Melrose Avenue created a problem he had not had to manage before. The top floor flat had no accessible garden and no space beneath the floorboards where anything could be stored, and the disposal methods that had served him at Melrose Avenue were no longer available to him, and he was forced to develop new approaches that were more complex, more dangerous, and ultimately the direct cause of his discovery. At Cranley Gardens, between late 1981 and February 1983, Nilsen caused the disappearance of 3 more young men, and the method he used to manage the resulting material involved attempting to conceal evidence through the plumbing system, which eventually caused the blockage that a resident reported, which brought Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. to the front door on the evening of February 9th, 1983. When officers searched the flat at Cranley Gardens on the night of Nilsen's arrest, every detective present has described it as the most disturbing scene they encountered across their entire careers. The property was small and contained an extraordinary amount of carefully concealed evidence, and the officers who worked through it that night have said in subsequent interviews that what they found in those rooms never fully left them. Nilsen cooperated with the investigation completely from the very first moment and showed no agitation and expressed nothing that anyone around him recognized as genuine remorse. He was interviewed 16 times over several months and provided investigators with an account of his activities that was extraordinarily specific and detailed, and the level of clinical precision in the way he described what he had done was something every investigator who sat across from him during those interviews described as deeply and lastingly unsettling. When the investigation moved to his previous address at Melrose Avenue and search teams began working through the back garden, they found extensive human remains in soil, and Nilsen had drawn a map for investigators showing exactly where each fire had been, and the map proved entirely accurate. Nilsen's trial took place at the Old Bailey, and he pleaded not guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility, with his defense arguing that his mental state at the time of the offences had been such that he could not be held fully accountable. The prosecution argued that the methodical and deliberate nature of everything Nilsen had done across 4 years demonstrated a capacity for rational planning that was entirely incompatible with any genuine diminished responsibility defense. The jury agreed with the prosecution, and on November 4th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen was found guilty on 6 counts and sentenced to life in prison, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. Names that were never found. Of the 15 young men Nilsen confessed to being responsible for the deaths of, only 8 were ever formally identified. 7 remain unknown to this day, with no names attached to them in any public record, and no families who have ever received confirmation of what happened to the people they lost. One investigator found 3 dental plates in the garden at Melrose Avenue and proposed making inquiries in Germany where the plates appeared to have been made, which might have led to identifications and to families finally receiving answers. The suggestion was declined because the cost was considered too high, and those 7 people remain unnamed. One of the young men who survived his encounter with Nilsen was a 21-year-old named Carl Stotter, who met Nilsen in April 1982 and went back to the flat at Cranley Gardens. He survived because Nilsen stopped and spent the following hours caring for him and helping him recover. And when Carl asked what had happened, Nilsen told him he had become entangled in his sleeping bag, and Carl, still disoriented, accepted that explanation and left. He reported the incident to police, and the police dismissed it. Carl Stotter was never the same person after that night. His sister Julie later spoke publicly about the decades of damage that followed, describing a man consumed by guilt over having survived when others had not, and by a drinking problem he was never able to resolve. Carl died alone in 2013 at the age of 52, and Julie has said that her son Jack, deeply affected by what had been done to his uncle, died by suicide years later, and that she holds Nilsen responsible for both of them. Martin Duffy was 16 years old when he travelled to London in May 1980 looking for work, and his family never heard from him again. His father kept a photograph of Martin by his bed and would look at it and ask where his son was, and the family spent 3 years not knowing, and the truth only came when Nilsen was arrested and began providing names. Martin's brother and sister have said publicly that the press habit of describing all of Nilsen's victims as homeless drifters was profoundly unjust and reduced people who were loved and missed and mourned to a category that said far more about how society valued them than it said about who they actually were. Dennis Nilsen died in prison on May 12, 2018, at the age of 72, having served 35 years and never expressed anything that the people around him recognized as genuine remorse. 7 of his victims remain unidentified. Their families have never had an answer. The survivors who went to the police and were not believed, the missing persons reports that went nowhere, the complaints that were set aside as not worth pursuing. All of it is part of this story, and none of it can be separated from it, because the conditions that allowed Dennis Nilsen to continue for 4 years were not created by one man alone. Dennis Nilsen operated without interruption for 4 years in one of the world's most watched cities, and nobody connected the disappearances until a drain blocked in February 1983. If stories like this one, where the truth is stranger and more disturbing than anything fictional, are what you are here for, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe and come back every week, because there are dozens of cases as significant as this one that most people have never heard of. Every name in every story here matters, and none of them should be forgotten. Now, let's move on to the second disturbing true crime story.
In my lifetime, I have harmed 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, arsons. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry. I don't believe in man, God, nor devil. I hate the whole human race, including myself. This wasn't a suspect breaking under interrogation pressure. They came from Carl Panzram in 1928, sitting in a Washington, D.C. jail cell, writing his life story with complete honesty. No regret, no excuses, just cold truth. When guards first heard him talking about his crimes, they dismissed it as attention-seeking nonsense. Prisoners fabricated stories all the time. But then investigators started checking his claims. Every location he mentioned, every date he provided, every detail he described, all of it checked out. Between 1920 and 1929, this man caused destruction across 3 continents. But here's what makes his story different. Carl Panzram didn't just confess. He explained everything. He documented it all. And what he revealed about how dangerous people are created will disturb you more than the crimes themselves. On June 28, 1891, in a farmhouse near East Grand Forks, Minnesota, Jan and Matilda Panzram welcomed their 6th child into the world. They named him Charles, though he would later prefer Carl. His parents, immigrants from East Prussia, ran their household with harsh discipline that bordered on cruelty. 7 children worked the fields from dawn to darkness, and when truancy laws forced them into school during the day, their parents made them work the fields at night. Carl later remembered getting only 2 hours of sleep before school. Punishments for any perceived failure included being chained up or deprived of food for days. There was no tenderness, no affection, only endless labor and brutal consequences for any sign of weakness. By age 5, Carl already saw himself as different from other children. He would later write that other children didn't like him, and he didn't like them either. He became a liar and a thief before he could properly tie his shoes, stealing small items from neighbors and classmates. But these were just the early warning signs of what was to come. When Carl was 7 years old, his father abandoned the family without warning, leaving Matilda to raise 7 children alone on a failing farm. Around this same time, Carl developed a serious infection in his skull that required surgery. The operation was performed at home, worsening the infection. When they finally took him to a hospital for proper medical care, the damage may have already been done. Doctors could never determine if the infection and botched surgery caused brain damage, but the timing was unmistakable. After the surgery, Carl's behavior became increasingly violent and uncontrollable. He would fly into rages at the slightest provocation, attacking other children and even adults who tried to discipline him. One by one, his older brothers left the farm, escaping the brutal conditions and leaving Carl behind. In 1905, his stepbrother Louis passed away while working as a lumberjack. Carl was now essentially alone with a mother who saw him as nothing but a burden and a source of free labor. In 1899, at just 8 years old, Carl was arrested for being intoxicated and disorderly. 4 years later, at 12, he was arrested again for being drunk and incorrigible. That same year, he committed his first major theft, stealing cake, apples, and a revolver from a neighbor's house. In October 1903, Matilda Panzram made a decision that would change her son forever. She sent 12-year-old Carl to the Minnesota State Training School, supposedly a reform school for troubled boys. What happened to Carl in that institution would destroy whatever humanity might have remained in him. The Minnesota State Training School was a house of horrors disguised as rehabilitation. Carl later wrote that staff members regularly beat and violated the children in a room they nicknamed the paint shop, because boys left that room painted with their own blood and bruises. The mistreatment was systematic, brutal, and constant. Carl's formal criminal education continued in 1906 when he was arrested for burglary in Butte, Montana. He was sentenced to 1 year at Montana State Reform School in Miles City. If the Minnesota Training School had been terrible, Montana was worse. When a guard named Bouchard punished Carl for some minor infraction, Carl's response was swift and devastating. He grabbed a wooden board and beat the guard so severely that the man was critically injured. For this, Carl was thrown into solitary confinement. But he didn't care. He had proven to himself that he could harm others worse than they could harm him. In 1907, Carl and another inmate escaped from Montana State Reform School. What followed was a week-long crime spree across Montana that included robbery, burglary, and arson. Carl had a particular hatred for churches and burned down several during this spree. When asked later why he targeted churches, Carl said he hated everything that claimed to represent goodness or hope. While intoxicated in a Helena saloon, he enlisted in the United States Army. The military assigned him to the 6th Infantry at Fort William Henry Harrison. But Carl was a hopeless soldier. He refused to follow orders and stole supplies. The Army court-martialed Carl for stealing supplies worth $84.24, a significant sum in 1907. His sentence was served at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, from April 1908 to August 1910. Carl would later write that if he had been troubled before Leavenworth, the military prison destroyed any remaining shred of goodness in him. The guards were brutal, even by early 20th century military justice standards. Carl was beaten, starved, and subjected to punishments that would be considered inhumane today. But instead of breaking him, these experiences taught Carl new levels of cruelty. When Carl was finally released and dishonorably discharged in August 1910, he was 20 years old and had spent most of his life in institutions. After his release from Leavenworth, Carl began a criminal career that would span the next 18 years. His pattern was consistent: steal everything he could carry, harm anyone who got in his way, and disappear before authorities could catch him. He developed a methodical approach to crime, carefully planning his robberies and always having an escape route prepared. Between 1910 and 1920, Carl was arrested and imprisoned repeatedly across the American West and Southwest. He served time in California, Texas, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Connecticut, and New York. Each imprisonment was marked by violence against guards and escape attempts. But Carl was also learning. With each arrest and imprisonment, he refined his methods, learned new criminal techniques from other inmates, and became more sophisticated in his approach to evading capture. In 1915, while serving time at Oregon State Penitentiary under the alias Jeff Baldwin, Carl helped a fellow inmate named Otto Hooker escape from prison. During Hooker's flight, he ended the life of prison superintendent Harry Minto. Although Carl hadn't pulled the trigger, he had made it possible. The feeling of being connected to such an act excited him in ways that simple robbery never had. Carl escaped from Oregon State Penitentiary twice, the second time by sawing through the bars of his cell. By 1918, when he successfully evaded capture after his second Oregon escape, Carl had become one of America's most wanted fugitives. Using the alias John O'Leary, Carl traveled across the country and even overseas. But he was also becoming bored with simple theft and assault. His mind was turning toward darker possibilities. He worked on ships, sailed to Panama and Europe, and spent time in Peru working in copper mines. Using the alias John O'Leary and various other false names, Carl traveled across the country and even overseas, always staying one step ahead of the law. He worked on merchant ships, sailed to Panama and Europe, and spent time in Peru working in copper mines. But wherever he went, Carl left a trail of theft, assault, and increasingly violence that went beyond robbery. He later wrote that he fantasized about poisoning city water supplies, sinking passenger ships, and starting wars between nations. These weren't idle daydreams. Carl was developing detailed plans for maximum destruction. He studied chemistry from prison library books, learned about explosives, and gathered knowledge about how to inflict the greatest amount of harm on the greatest number of people. But Carl also recognized that such grand schemes required resources and planning beyond his current capabilities. So he continued with what he knew: robbery, assault, and staying ahead of the authorities. The year 1920 marked Carl Panzram's transformation into a true serial criminal. After a successful jewelry store robbery in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Carl found himself with $1,500 in cash. But before he could begin his plans, Carl needed to settle an old score. He had never forgotten his brutal treatment at Fort Leavenworth, and he especially remembered the man whose signature had approved his sentence, William Howard Taft, who had been Secretary of War when Carl was court-martialed and was now a former U.S. president. On September 16, 1920, Carl burglarized Taft's mansion in New Haven, Connecticut. He stole jewelry and bonds, but the prize he really wanted was Taft's personal Colt M19 11.45 caliber handgun. Carl later wrote that stealing from Taft gave him more satisfaction than all his previous crimes combined. It wasn't just theft, it was personal revenge. Using Taft's stolen money, Carl purchased a small sailing yacht called the Akista. The boat was about 40 feet long, perfect for coastal sailing, and most importantly, it gave Carl the mobility and privacy he needed for what he planned next. This boat would become his mobile crime platform for the next several years, a floating tomb where multiple victims would meet their end. Carl sailed the Akista to City Island in the Bronx, where he began hunting for victims among the sailors who frequented the waterfront bars. He would approach lone sailors in bars, offering them work on his yacht, or simply inviting them aboard for drinks. Once his victims were on the boat, Carl would get them intoxicated, assault them, use Taft's stolen pistol, and dispose of their bodies in Long Island Sound near Execution Rocks Light. The location wasn't chosen randomly. Execution Rock's light had earned its name because of the dangerous rocks that had wrecked countless ships over the years. Carl knew that bodies disposed there would either be swept out to sea or smashed against the rocks beyond recognition. For 3 months from his base at City Island, Carl systematically harmed sailors. He later claimed to have taken 10 lives during this period, though only some of these crimes could be verified. What is certain is that several sailors disappeared after being seen with a man matching Carl's description, and their bodies were never found. Carl's yacht-based crime spree ended only by accident. During rough weather, the Acasta ran aground and sank near Atlantic City, New Jersey. Carl's last 2 intended victims managed to escape during the chaos. After losing his boat, Carl was arrested in Stamford, Connecticut for burglary and possession of a loaded handgun. Upon his release in 1921, Carl traveled to Philadelphia, where he got into an armed confrontation with police. Facing a long prison sentence, he managed to make bail and immediately fled to Norfolk, Virginia, where he caught a ship to Portuguese Angola in southern Africa. What Carl did in Angola represents some of the most disturbing crimes in his entire history. Working as a foreman on an oil rig, Carl had access to isolated areas and vulnerable local populations. When he grew bored with the work, he burned down the oil rig out of spite. According to his own confession, Carl committed terrible crimes against an Angolan boy estimated to be 11 or 12 years old. Carl wrote that he hired 6 local men to take him crocodile hunting in a canoe. Once they were in the remote backwaters, Carl used a Luger pistol against all 6 men and fed their bodies to the crocodiles. When local authorities began investigating the disappearances, Carl was forced to flee through the rainforest to the Belgian Congo. Carl's return to the United States in 1922 marked the beginning of the most intensively documented period of his criminal career. In July 1922 in Salem, Massachusetts, Carl took the life of a young boy. Later that year, near New Haven, Connecticut, he harmed another child. In June 1923, he stole 2 yachts in quick succession. The second yacht belonged to the local police chief of New Rochelle, a choice that demonstrated Carl's growing contempt for law enforcement. Using the police chief's stolen yacht, Carl picked up a 15-year-old boy named George Wallison, promising him a job on the boat. On June 27, 1923, while sailing near Kingston, New York, Carl encountered a man who he believed was planning to rob him. Carl's response was immediate and fatal. George Wallison watched this happen. The next day, when they docked at Peekskill, Wallison finally saw his chance. While Carl was distracted, Wallison jumped overboard and swam to shore. He immediately reported both his own assault and the crime he had witnessed to police in Yonkers. For the first time in his criminal career, Carl faced charges that included not just robbery and assault, but something far more serious. A witness had survived, and the authorities finally had testimony that could put Carl away for life. Carl's response to his arrest revealed the cunning intelligence that had kept him free for so many years. He convinced his lawyer to accept ownership of a stolen boat in exchange for bail money, then immediately skipped bail. His freedom lasted only 2 months. On August 26, 1923, John O'Leary was arrested in Larchmont, New York after breaking into a train depot. Carl was sentenced to 5 years in prison, to be served first at Sing Sing Prison and later at Clinton Prison in Dannemora. Even in maximum security, Carl couldn't stop himself from attempting violence. He tried to escape from Clinton Prison and ended up with serious injuries, including a damaged spine and broken ankles. When he was discharged in July 1928, after serving nearly 5 years, Carl had come to a disturbing conclusion about his own nature. He wasn't going to stop. Carl's last month of freedom, August 1928, was a concentrated burst of the violence that had defined his entire adult life. On August 20th, He burglarized a dentist's home in Washington, D.C., but simple theft no longer satisfied him. During that same month, Carl harmed at least 3 more victims. In Salem, he took the life of a young boy. In Connecticut, he harmed another child. And in Philadelphia, he ended the life of 14-year-old Alexander Ushak, a newsboy who had the misfortune of encountering Carl near the Delaware River. When Carl was arrested on August 30th, 1928, he was no longer the cunning escapist who had evaded capture for so many years. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, and ready for whatever consequences his crimes would bring. For the first time in his criminal career, Carl gave the police his real name. During his interrogation, Carl confessed to multiple crimes with a level of detail that shocked even experienced detectives. When asked why he harmed children, Carl's response was chillingly honest. "I hate the human race, and I get satisfaction from harming people." Given his extensive criminal record and his confessions to 21 lives taken, Carl Panzram was sentenced to 25 years to life at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. He was assigned inmate number 31,614. Coincidentally, nearly the same institution where his transformation into a criminal had begun 18 years earlier. Carl's warning to the warden was characteristically direct. "I'll harm the first man that bothers me." The prison authorities, recognizing that Carl was too dangerous for normal work assignments, placed him alone in the laundry room under the supervision of civilian foreman Robert Warnke. Warnke had a reputation for bullying and harassing prisoners. Despite repeated warnings from Carl, Warnke continued his aggressive behavior. On June 20th, 1929, Carl made good on his promise. Using an iron bar, he beat Robert Warnke, ending his life and crushing the man's skull completely. Carl's trial for Warnke's demise was swift. He was convicted and sentenced to passing by hanging. When offered the opportunity for appeals, Carl's response was typical. He refused all legal assistance and told anyone who tried to help him that he wished they all had one neck and that I had my hands on it. While on death row, Carl encountered the only person who had ever shown him genuine kindness. Prison guard Henry Lesser began giving Carl small amounts of money to buy cigarettes. This simple act of humanity so surprised Carl that when Lesser provided him with writing materials, Carl began documenting his entire criminal career. The result was a detailed autobiography that remains one of the most disturbing documents in criminal history. Carl began his written confession with words that revealed the complete absence of remorse that had driven his crimes. "In my lifetime, I have harmed 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, acts of arson, and other crimes. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." On September 5th, 1930, Carl Panzram walked to the gallows at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Even in his final moments, he remained defiant. As guards attempted to place the traditional black hood over his head, Carl spat in the executioner's face. When asked for any last words, Carl's response was perfectly in character. "Yes, hurry it up. I could harm a dozen men while you're wasting time." At 6:02 a.m., Carl Panzram was declared gone. He was 39 years old and had spent more than half his life in various prisons and reform schools. His passing ended a criminal career that had spanned 3 decades and multiple continents. Carl Panzram's story reminds us of the critical importance of recognizing and addressing violence before it escalates. If this case made you think about the nature of evil and redemption, share this video to spread awareness. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most notorious criminals. And remember, staying informed about these dark chapters helps us build a safer future. Together, we can learn from the past to protect the present.
Now, let's move on to the third horrifying serial killer story.
It was past 2 in the morning in San Francisco. The bars had closed and people were filtering into the nearest diner, finding seats, ordering coffee. At one table, a young man sat alone with a pen and a napkin. He was drawing animals, small and careful, and genuinely impressive. A man nearby noticed them and said so. They started talking. They left together. By morning, the man who had admired those drawings was in a hospital. The artist was gone. And here's the part that makes this story different from most. By the time investigators understood exactly who they were looking for, they had already found him. What they could not do was stop him. That answer begins in San Francisco in 1974. San Francisco in 1974 was already stretched thin, with the Zodiac case still unsolved and the zebra attacks pushing 16 homicide investigators well beyond their capacity. When a man was found seriously harmed on Ocean Beach in the early hours of January 27, 1974, it was logged and worked alongside everything else already demanding attention. The man was Gerald Kavanaugh, 50 years old, a Canadian-born worker who had made San Francisco his home and who spent his evenings in the social spaces of the Castro and Tenderloin neighborhoods. He carried a Timex watch and a small amount of cash when he was found. There was no identification on him, and he became temporarily one of several unidentified individuals recorded that year in San Francisco. It took investigators 2 days to connect him to a name. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a brief item on page 42 asking for public assistance in identifying him. Nobody came forward. The anonymous caller who had reported Gerald that night never appeared either. Investigators believed he had been at that beach for the same reason Gerald was, and that making himself known would have exposed him in ways that could cost him his job, his housing, and every relationship he had carefully built. He chose silence. To understand this case, you have to understand what it meant to be a gay man in San Francisco in 1974. The Castro and Tenderloin offered community and belonging, but the police department had a long history of hostility toward those spaces, and being associated with them could cost a person their career, their family, and everything they had built. Going to the police was simply not a safe option for most people in that community, and the person who came to be known as the Doodler understood that completely. He operated inside those same bars and diners, sat at the same tables, and had correctly calculated that the people most likely to have seen him were the least likely to speak about it. 5 months after Gerald Kavanaugh was found on Ocean Beach, a man named Joseph Stevens was discovered on a path beside Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park, approximately 1.5 miles from where Gerald had been found. Joseph was 27 years old and known throughout the Castro community as Jay, a performer and entertainer who had built a genuine and loyal following in the neighborhood. He had a regular show at a club on Polk Street and had recently secured a headline booking at a well-known and respected venue in North Beach. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, was careful about his personal safety in a neighborhood where he understood the risks, and was not the kind of person who took unnecessary chances. He was found with serious injuries on the path. A witness had seen him leave a club the previous night in conversation with a tall, slim young man whose face he had not clearly seen. 10 days later, a woman walking her dog along Ocean Beach in the early morning found Klaus Christmann, 31 years old, a German national who had come to San Francisco several months earlier to establish a life that he planned to eventually bring his wife and 2 young children into from Germany. He was last seen at a club in the Tenderloin the night before he was found. The nature of his injuries was considerably more serious than in the previous cases. Klaus Christmann's family in Germany received a telegram. They had been expecting letters about the new life he was building. They received 7 words instead. Almost a full year passed after that. Then, in May 1975, Frederick Capon was found on Ocean Beach, approximately 1 block from where Gerald Kavanaugh had been found 16 months earlier. Frederick was 32 years old, a registered nurse working at a San Francisco hospital, and a Navy veteran who had served as a combat medic during the Vietnam War. He had called his sister earlier that year to tell her the city felt unsafe and that he was planning to relocate somewhere she could actually come and visit him comfortably. She never had the chance to make that trip. Less than a month after Frederick was found, a hiker near Lincoln Park discovered Harold Gullberg, 66 years old, a Swedish-born merchant seaman who had made San Francisco his permanent home over many years at sea. Nobody had reported Harold missing because there was nobody close enough in his life to notice he was gone. Then in April 1975, between those two cases, a man named Warren Andrews was found seriously harmed near Land's End, a clifftop area overlooking the ocean. He never recovered. He passed away weeks later without ever being able to speak to investigators about what had happened to him that night. 6 individuals across 18 months, all in the same city, all connected to the same social spaces, all found in parks, on the waterfront, or along the city's coastal areas. The connection was visible the moment anyone looked at all 6 cases together. The problem was that nobody looked at them together for longer than it should have taken. In the summer of 1975, a man arrived at a San Francisco medical facility, having been seriously harmed. He had made his way there himself from a nearby high-rise apartment building on Market Street. He was alive. He did not want to file a police report. He was a European diplomat stationed in San Francisco and was deeply afraid of what disclosure would mean for his career and his government posting. He eventually agreed to speak with investigators on the strict condition that his identity would be fully and permanently protected. His account gave this case the name it has carried ever since. He had been at a diner on Market Street when a young man nearby caught his attention, drawing small animals on a napkin with careful, skilled strokes. They struck up a conversation and eventually left together. Once at the diplomat's apartment, a confrontation followed, and the diplomat was seriously harmed before his visitor left. He survived and described his attacker as a young black man, tall and slim, between 19 and 23 years old, with high cheekbones and a calm that felt deliberate rather than natural. 2 more survivors came forward around the same time. One lived in the same apartment building as the diplomat, on the same floor, and had survived a similar encounter when neighbors heard sounds from the apartment and building security responded in time. The other was a well-known American entertainer whose name investigators chose not to release, someone whose public career could not have survived the disclosure of his presence in those social spaces. In his case, a concealed tool had fallen from the attacker's clothing during the encounter, and he had been able to leave immediately. He departed San Francisco not long afterward and had no further contact with law enforcement regarding the matter. All 3 survivors could describe their attacker in precise detail. All 3 knew exactly who he was. Not one of them was willing to say so in a courtroom, and nobody who understood their situation could honestly say they did not understand why. In October 1975, lead investigators Rotia Guilford and Earl Sanders worked with a sketch artist using the diplomat's detailed and consistent description to produce a composite image of the suspect. Tips came in quickly once the image was public. An anonymous woman called with a first name. She called back 10 days later, frustrated that nothing visible had happened, and this time provided a home address, an age range, and a license plate number. A secretary at a hospital in the East Bay called to say that her employer had recognized the sketch immediately. 3 days after that, the employer himself called. He was a practicing psychiatrist. His patient had admitted to the attacks during a therapy session, he said. He had no doubt whatsoever about the identification. Investigators now had a name, an address, a license plate, a psychiatric disclosure, and 3 witnesses who could identify the suspect directly. They brought him in for a formal interview in January 1976, and he came in voluntarily, without a lawyer, sitting down across from Guilford and Sanders with complete composure. The suspect sat across from Guilford and Sanders and answered their questions with apparent ease and no visible anxiety. He told them he had struggled with his personal identity since his early teens. He acknowledged that he had sought help from a therapist and said that the sessions had resolved the internal conflict he had been carrying. He mentioned that he had a girlfriend and that his life had moved in a different direction. He said he had changed. Then he denied being the person they were looking for, thanked the investigators for their time, stood up from the chair, and walked out the front door of the San Francisco Police Department as a free man. Guilford later told the San Francisco Chronicle that the man's own description of his background and experiences matched the investigative profile they had built so precisely that there was no doubt in his mind about who he was speaking to. That certainty, however, was not evidence that a court could use. What Guilford and Sanders had assembled was, by any ordinary standard of investigation, a compelling case. What they did not have was anything that could survive the specific legal requirements of a criminal prosecution. The psychiatric disclosure was protected by confidentiality laws between a therapist and patient. While those laws had been updated in 1975 to include a duty to warn in situations of ongoing threat, translating a therapist's phone call into admissible courtroom evidence was an entirely different legal question, and the answer to that question was not a favorable one. The anonymous woman who had called twice with the suspect's name, address, and license plate had never identified herself and could not be subpoenaed or called as a witness. That left only the 3 survivors. The diplomat had identified the suspect from a photograph collection and had no hesitation in doing so privately. But he would not go further. He was not willing to have his name, his presence in those social spaces, or any detail of his personal life become part of a public legal record that could reach his government. The second survivor refused any process that might expose his identity. The entertainer had already left the city. All 3 of them were willing to say, in private, to investigators they trusted, that they knew exactly who had done this to them. None of them could say it publicly in a courtroom without consequences that the world they were living in made genuinely unbearable. Harvey Milk, who was building toward his eventual election to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, spoke about this situation directly and publicly. He said he understood the position those survivors were in. He said the pressure that society had placed on them was real, and that their choice deserved to be respected. The investigation went cold. The suspect left San Francisco. The cases went into the files, and the structural forces that had protected this person from the beginning continued doing so long after he was gone. In 2017, San Francisco Police Department Inspector Dan Cunningham formally reopened the case and began a complete review of everything that had been gathered across 4 decades. What he found was a record preserved in fragments. Files had been separated from their documentation during moves between departments over the years. Evidence had been stored in ways that disconnected it from the context that gave it meaning. Notes referenced names and locations that no longer matched anything in active databases. Cunningham later described working from the very beginning as an advantage rather than a limitation, because starting completely fresh forced him to examine connections and patterns that earlier investigators had either missed or passed over while working with incomplete information under the pressures of active cases. The primary suspect from the 1970s was still alive. He was living in the East Bay, not far from San Francisco. According to reporting by the San Francisco Chronicle, he had been living openly as a gay man for a number of years, a detail that carries its own weight given what investigators have long believed about the internal conflict that shaped his behavior during those 18 months in 1974 and 1975. Cunningham interviewed him in 2018. The man said precisely what he had said to Guilford and Sanders 42 years earlier. He denied any involvement in the cases. He was composed, cooperative in manner, and gave nothing away. During the course of that 2018 interview, investigators collected a DNA sample from the suspect, without his awareness that they were doing so. That sample was then compared against biological material recovered and preserved from the original scenes in the 1970s. No public announcement of a match or a result has been made as of the most recent available reporting. The reinvestigation ran into the same fundamental obstacle that had stopped the original investigation, now appearing in a different form 50 years later. The only surviving record of the psychiatrist who had called police in 1975 was a handwritten note in Rotia Guilford's case files that read Dr. Priest, psychiatrist, Highland Hospital, East Bay. When Cunningham searched for any record of a practicing psychiatrist by that name at Highland Hospital during the relevant period, he found nothing that matched. The hospital had no record of anyone by that name. A journalist working alongside the reinvestigation later identified a possible match in Dr. Howard Priest, whose professional history and practice background aligned closely with the description in Guilford's notes. But Dr. Priest had passed away in 2005. His patient records were held by the hospital and were not accessible without a court order. Cunningham sought that court order. The judge reviewing the request declined it, stating that the available evidence did not establish that the former patient continued to represent a threat to public safety, sufficient to override the confidentiality that still applied to those records even after the therapist's death. The records remain inaccessible. In 2019, the San Francisco Police Department announced a public reward of $100,000 for information leading to a formal arrest in connection with these cases. That reward was subsequently increased to $250,000, where it stands today. The department also took the significant step of releasing, for the very first time, the original audio recording of the anonymous 911 call made in the early morning hours of January 27, 1974. The call that first brought officers to Ocean Beach and to Gerald Kavanaugh. Investigators hoped that someone, somewhere, might recognize the voice of the caller who had never come forward. The caller has still not been identified. Rotia Guilford and Earl Sanders are two of the most important figures in this case, and they deserve more recognition than the official record has given them. Guilford became the first African-American officer to lead the SFPD Homicide Division. Sanders became the department's eventual chief of police. Within the Castro and Tenderloin communities, they were known as the Soul Brothers, a name given with genuine respect by people who had every reason to distrust the institution they represented. What set them apart was their approach. Rather than working from a distance, they went inside those spaces, sat in the bars, spoke to regulars, and came back repeatedly until people trusted them enough to share what they knew. Every major development in the investigation came through that trust. Guilford carried this case for the rest of his career, speaking about it to journalists years later with the same certainty he had in 1976. He never stopped believing they had the right person. 6 people lost their lives across those 18 months in San Francisco. 3 survivors knew exactly who was responsible, and could not safely say so in public. A psychiatrist reported a patient confession, and the legal system had no clean way to use it. An anonymous woman called the police twice with the suspect's name and address, and then disappeared back into the city. Two of the most capable investigators in the department's history sat across from the man they were certain had done all of this, watched him answer their questions calmly, and watched him walk out the door. That was 1976. The same man was interviewed again in 2018. He walked out that door too. The case is still open. The reward is still active at $250,000, and the detective assigned to this case has not stopped working. Sometimes justice moves slower than anyone involved deserves. Sometimes it has not arrived yet. Every week on this channel, we cover the cases that reveal how the system works and where it falls short. If this story held your attention all the way through, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. These are the cases that deserve to be fully understood, not just briefly remembered. Subscribe and stay with us.